Chapter 2. For 2 months, the empire has been preparing extensively. The imperial treasury approved millions of gold and sawani to fulfill the preparations. These gold coins were used to purchase supplies, horses, weapons, and equipment. Only the professional legionnaires would be paid for the campaign. The newly conscripted foot soldiers would receive nothing but a meal and the right to plunder whatever they found on the other side. Yet, legionnaires weren't the only unit that got paid. There were cavalry units, legionnaires, and wyvern riders. Wyvern riders were the most elite unit in the entire army. That's why their numbers were small compared to the other units. The wyvern riders unit consisted of only 500 riders. In contrast, horses were kept in every stable around the imperial capital, including those belonging to normal plebeians. Some were paid to do so, some were persuaded to let the cavalry horses into their stables. This normally wouldn't happen, but on this occasion, the number of horses added to the whole army was staggering. With a total of 40,000 horses, trained for cavalry duties, prepared for the conquest. The number of horses, however, paled in comparison to the foot soldiers. The professional legionnaires alone numbered 30,000. They were gathered from outposts around the empire's territory. Some outposts even became vulnerable because of this. Yet, the empire didn't budge and simply shrugged it off since they had reserves in the capital. The professional legionnaires were numerous, but the newly conscripted levies were the dominant force in the whole army for this campaign. Numbering up to 70,000, these levies, or newly conscripted armies, were called up from every city, town, and village around the empire and its vassals. To add more strength to the whole army, some patricians formed their own armies, made up of mercenaries and their own levies. The numbers varied, but it is estimated that each patrician who formed a private army had around 2,000 men. Although it was a problematic issue to have their own armies in a campaign supposed to be run by the empire, the generals and the emperor finally allowed them, as long as they didn't disturb the overall strategy. In the end, around 160,000 soldiers were called for the campaign. It was a staggering, gigantic army. It had been a long time since the empire had raised such a large army for a single campaign. If not for the supply issues, the empire could have brought even more soldiers. Nevertheless, all the elements in the empire's government were satisfied with the sheer number of soldiers they had for the campaign. They were confident it would be an easy feat to conquer whatever lay across the gate. It was normal to think so. They had been uncontested for more than half a millennium. All the inhabitants of the continent feared them. They were the most fearsome army in the whole continent, the best one, the most prestigious one. Because of this, they hadn't fully prepared the supply rations for a long-term campaign. At best, they could only survive for 2 months. But neither the generals nor the patricians were bothered. They all believed it would end in less than a month. As for the leadership, there was a heated debate over who would take charge of the campaign. Patricians, senators, generals, and even princes appointed themselves as leaders. Some even schemed to gain the position. Emperor Molt had to intervene once again to settle the conflict. He carefully considered every party that promoted themselves. However, he couldn't choose based solely on ability. If he wanted to choose based on tactical ability and the way to run a war, it was obvious that one of the generals would be the best choice. However, he needed to please some of his vassals, patricians, and even his own blood relatives. If he didn't do so, the support to keep him on the throne would be reduced. His sons, in particular, were hungry for glory and prestige. Zorzel and Diabo had been fighting each other behind everyone's backs to secure the throne in the future. Zorzel might have the upper hand since he was the crown prince, but Diabo's schemes and intelligence were not a simple threat and could snatch the throne from him. There was also his third child, Pina. She was the only female direct descendant. It seemed she didn't have any ambition to take the throne. However, she was eager to make a name for herself as a knight. She founded a new knight order, the Rose Knight Order, from nothing. She gathered every noble's daughter to be her fellow, and over time, she gained support from some influential plebeians and successfully maintained her own knight order into a fine army. In a way, the emperor was proud of her achievements, yet he was concerned that she might become a threat in some ways. Pina might not have any ambition to take the throne, but she was eager to gain acknowledgement. As a female, she didn't possess many traits that females were expected to have. She was aware of her looks, but that was all. She couldn't perform with elegance, didn't enjoy being fashionable, and was pretty awful at dancing. But she found that being a knight was her best environment. Emperor Molt knew this. That's why he wanted to give Pina a chance. A chance to prove herself and polish her knighthood. But it couldn't be decided that easily. He needed someone who understood how to run a campaign, yet he couldn't simply choose the generals to take over. The patricians and senators would be disappointed, and their support for him could diminish. Losing support from both parties could lead to a dangerous situation. And so, after spending a full night in consideration, he decided to let one of the patricians lead the entire campaign. A man in his late 50s, named Callios. He was a war veteran who had served as a general for 20 years, and when he retired, he inherited his status as marquis from his deceased father. He was well respected by all parties, including senators, patricians, and the military. Marquis Callios was well versed in strategy, decent in the nobility world, and, in person, he was a first-rate swordsman. If he weren't old, he could probably defeat Zorzel in single combat. Aside from Marquis Callios, Molt also chose his vice-leader. He chose Diabo to serve as vice-leader. Of course, this decision was not fully accepted by both Diabo and Zorzel. Diabo wanted to be the main leader, while Zorzel protested that he couldn't join the campaign at all. But Molt diffused the tension by giving Zorzel the right to lead the reserve legionnaires stationed in the capital. Although it wasn't as many as the legionnaires sent for the campaign, around 20,000 legionnaires was still a huge army. This reserve existed for contingencies, such as rebellion or a sudden attack from barbarians. Molt used sweet words to convince Zorzel that the empire might be vulnerable since most of the soldiers were away for the conquest campaign in the otherworld. If a sudden attack occurred, Zorzel would be the first to handle it and would later be hailed as a hero. Those sweet words eventually succeeded in appeasing Zorzel. Diabo, on the other hand, was dealt with more harshly. Molt threatened him with punishment for disobedience, which could be considered treason. A punishment, from Diabo's perspective, was quite dangerous since he needed to build a good image with everyone he knew. In the end, Diabo reluctantly accepted his lower status compared to Marquis Callios. Pina was a bit disappointed that her knights weren't counted as an expeditionary force. But Emperor Molt gave her a task to guard the gate while the main army conducted their conquest. Just in case something unwanted happened to the gate. And so, the whole army was complete. 160,000 combined soldiers, led by Marquis Callios and Prince Diabo, did their last preparation before the gate appeared. "Just 1 week left," said the priest from Belnago, "then the gate will appear at Alnus Hill." The army had already set up camp at Alnus Hill a week ago. This news was warmly welcomed. "Diabo-sama, we shall begin preparing." "Yes, Lord Callios. Let's conquer the other side and bring them our civilization. For glory." A cup of fine wine was raised by Lord Callios. "For glory." The whole camp of officers erupted. On the day promised by the priest, Marquis Callios had already formed the first troops early in the morning. Some days before, Marquis Callios, Prince Diabo, and other military generals had gathered to discuss how they would start. Some patricians with no military knowledge insisted on sending the entire army in one go. But this proposition was immediately rejected since, by estimation, the gate itself wouldn't be big enough to let 160,000 soldiers march through to the other world. Additionally, some cautious figures suggested it was better to send a scout first and give them a day or two to scout the area. However, this proposition was also rejected because it seemed cowardly and a waste of time. Marquis Callios actually agreed with the latter, but as Emperor Molt had already experienced, he needed to please most of his retinue. Luckily, Prince Diabo suggested a good idea, dividing the army into several waves and sending them through the gate one after another. The first wave would consist of 20,000 combined troops. They were given the right to plunder immediately and conquer any possible place. But the main mission was for scouting. The first wave would fully consist of legionnaires, cavalry, and wyvern riders. The levies would come in the second and third waves. The purpose was to create a strong front line with the legionnaires, while the rear was guarded by fellow legionnaires who would come in the last waves. Those waves would also need a leader. As usual, there was a dispute over who would lead the first wave, as it was seen as the most honorable position. Yet again, Lord Callios and Prince Diabo had to rack their brains to choose a leader for each wave. Although they were confident in their army's strength, it was still important to make a strong front line. When the day came, the Empire was more than ready. Whatever lay beyond the gate was nothing compared to the mighty Satyran Empire. That's what they believed, and they had every right to think so. As the sun rose above the horizon, the soldiers of the Empire saw the magical structures appear out of nowhere on top of the hill. There was no sound, there was no movement, yet the gate suddenly appeared before the sun had fully risen. A giant structure with dark green-colored walls, more than 300 meters high and 500 meters long, with mysterious carved symbols on its giant doors, the gate was a sight to behold. As they saw the gate, everyone smiled. In their imagination, the land beyond the gate was nothing more than a gold mine provided by the gods. The first to come, the first to serve. That's why there was growing hatred and jealousy between the legionnaires and the levies. But those in command simply brushed it off as if nothing happened. And so, early in the morning, the horn to signal the army to move was blown. The first wave had been prepared since the sun had risen. They were fully motivated. The morale was at its maximum limit. Everyone marched with proud smiles and stern postures. We're going to be rich. Their minds were filled with thoughts of wealth, glory, and triumph. They marched toward the gate. The gate opened by itself. The army's smiles grew wider. They marched again, into the pitch-black place. At first, they started to feel nervous, but they remembered once again what could lie beyond it. So they kept marching, and they prevailed. After marching only several hundred meters, they could see a bright light at the end of the passage. The only thing that kept them together was their discipline as legionnaires. If they were the levies, they would surely have rushed their way to the end of the passage. The leader of the first wave, General Agnias, led the army in an orderly march toward the light. And as they reached the light, they were stopped. There was something not right. Something was not according to their plan. No, something was not according to their expectations. The rear column finally caught up, only to see their comrades in front stopped with odd expressions. The happy mood earlier suddenly changed to confusion. The horses also stopped, sensing fear. The cause was the sight in front of them. A sight that would make any normal human shiver with fear. Soon, the confusion turned into terror. Because what awaited in front of them was an army of fully equipped giant high orcs.